My name is Ben Keller. I'm 33 years old now, but the story I'm about to tell happened in the fall of 2019. It took place in northern Idaho, not far from the Canadian border, in a remote area called Coldwater Ridge. I hadn't planned on going out there. It wasn't some long-awaited trip or special getaway. The cabin wasn't even mine. It belonged to my older cousin, Matt. He had bought it the year before, planning to turn it into a hunting base or maybe a vacation rental. But he never really got around to doing anything with it, and after his divorce, he didn't want to deal with it at all. He offered it to me for a week if I wanted to get away. At the time, I was burnt out from work and needed to be alone for a while. I accepted without thinking too hard about it. I should have asked more questions. Coldwater Ridge wasn't the kind of place you stumbled onto by accident. It sat high above a small town called Bonner's Hollow, about an hour of uphill driving from the nearest paved road. You had to pass through 2 rusted-out metal gates, then wind through about 6 miles of overgrown trail until you reached the base of a steep incline that led to the ridge. The trail was narrow and uneven. At some points, I wasn't sure my old Jeep Wrangler would make it, but somehow it did. The cabin itself was rough. Not dangerous, but definitely not the kind of place you'd want to stay in if you were expecting comfort. It was a single-room log structure, probably 20 by 30 feet at most. There was a small wood-burning stove in the corner, a fold-out cot, a rickety table, and one dusty window with a warped frame that barely closed. The air inside smelled like old wood and dried pine needles, with a faint scent of mildew. No electricity, no plumbing, no insulation. Just 4 walls and a roof. The view, though, was incredible. The ridge overlooked a valley that stretched out into the mountains. It was late September, and the leaves had already started turning. Reds, oranges, and yellows blanketed the hills like fire. There was a stillness in the air, the kind you only get when you're far from everything. No buzzing from power lines, no traffic, no people yelling in the distance. Just wind and trees. I unloaded my gear. 1 backpack with clothes, a sleeping bag, a box of freeze-dried food, and a cooler full of water and a few beers. I brought a flashlight, 2 books, and my phone, though I had no signal the second I passed through the second gate. I didn't bring a gun. In hindsight, that was stupid. I don't hunt, and I figured bear spray would be enough. It wasn't. The first day was quiet. I walked the perimeter of the ridge, taking in the silence and the rawness of the place. There were no other cabins nearby, no fire pits, no signs of life, really, just endless trees and steep cliffs on the northern side. I sat on the edge of the ridge that night and watched the sunset. The sky turned pink and gold, and for a little while I felt at peace. I ate a pack of chili mac and went to sleep on the cot, listening to the wind scrape against the logs. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. It wasn't a loud sound, just something soft and out of place. I stayed still, ears open. Then I heard it again, a scraping noise. Not the wind this time. This was slower, more deliberate. It was coming from behind the cabin, maybe 10 or 15 feet away. I held my breath and sat up slowly, reaching for my flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just waited. The sound came again, closer now, like something dragging along the outside wall. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or porcupine, maybe, but the steps, if that's what they were, sounded heavy, slow. For steps, then a pause, then 3 more, right along the back wall, heading toward the side window. I stood up, careful not to knock over the cot, and crept toward the window. The glass was cloudy, so I couldn't see clearly, but I stared out, holding the flashlight like a weapon, ready to swing. The steps stopped. Total silence. I stayed like that for almost an hour. Nothing moved. Eventually, I told myself it had to be an animal and climbed back into the sleeping bag. But I didn't fall asleep again. Not that night. The next morning, I circled the cabin looking for prints or marks. The ground was hard and dry. No mud, no snow yet, so there weren't any tracks. I looked for claw marks on the logs. Nothing. I tried to brush it off, but my gut said something was off. I kept checking over my shoulder the rest of the day. That afternoon, I walked a mile or so downhill to find a spring Matt told me about. It was supposed to be the only fresh water source nearby. I brought a small filter pump and refilled my bottles. On the way back up, I saw something that stopped me cold. About halfway up the trail, I noticed a tree with deep cuts in the bark. Long gouges vertical about shoulder height. I've seen what bear marks look like. These weren't those. They were too narrow, too straight. And there were 5 of them, evenly spaced like fingers. I told myself it could have been someone playing a joke, or maybe a hunter marking territory. But why way out here? I made it back to the cabin and tried to shake it off. I boiled water, ate another meal, and sat on the edge of the ridge again, but I didn't feel peaceful this time. I felt watched. That night, I locked the door, though it was just a wooden latch, and jammed the chair under the knob. I kept the flashlight in one hand and the bear spray in the other. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, breathing. It was coming from just outside the front wall. Heavy, labored breathing, like someone who'd been running and had stopped to catch their breath. It went on for 5 minutes, then stopped. I sat there in the dark, muscles cramped, my eyes burning from staying open. I didn't move until the sun came up. I knew I should have left that morning, packed my gear and driven out, but I was stubborn. I didn't want to admit that something was wrong, or that I was scared. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then leave. I couldn't explain what was happening. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe I was freaking myself out. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped some wood with the dull axe mat left behind. I tried reading, but I couldn't focus. My ears kept picking up sounds that didn't belong. Snaps, cracks, distant whistles. At one point, I thought I saw something move in the trees about 50 yards out. A flash of dark green or black. But when I looked directly at it, nothing was there. At sunset, I built a fire in the old stone pit outside the cabin. I sat next to it for a while, hoping the light would make me feel safer. But it didn't. It just made the shadows deeper. When it got dark enough, I put the fire out and went back inside. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something slam into the side of the cabin. It was loud enough to knock dust from the rafters. I jumped up, heart pounding, flashlight shaking in my hand. Another slam, then silence. I moved to the window and aimed the light outside. Nothing. I couldn't see anything but the trees. Then I heard the breathing again. This time it was closer, just on the other side of the wall. And then something worse, scraping again. Not along the wall this time, but across the roof. Slow, dragging sounds. Something or someone was up there. I bolted out the door, flashlight in one hand, bear spray in the other. I aimed the light at the roof. Nothing. But when I turned around, I saw it. There was a man standing at the edge of the trees. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. He wore a hooded jacket and old jeans. His face was shadowed. I couldn't make out details, just the outline. I raised the bear spray and stepped back toward the door. He didn't move. I went inside, locked the door, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, he was gone. I packed everything I had and shoved it into the Jeep. I didn't eat. I didn't take one last look at the view. I just drove. I made it to Bonner's Hollow by mid-afternoon and went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them everything. They listened, took some notes, then told me they'd send someone up in a few days to check it out. But they didn't seem too concerned. One of the deputies asked if maybe I'd seen a squatter or poacher. That was it. I never went back to the cabin. Matt sold it 6 months later. I don't know who bought it. I don't think I was the first person that man watched. And I don't think I would have left the ridge if I'd stayed one more night. I learned something important up there. The wilderness isn't just trees and trails and fresh air. Sometimes, it's the perfect place for people to hide. People who don't want to be found. People who watch. People who wait. And sometimes you don't find out why until it's too late. But I got out. I got out before whatever was going to happen happened. And that's enough for me. It was mid-October when I arrived at the cabin. My name is David, and I'm 32 years old. I had been working a desk job for years, and the stress had built up. After one too many sleepless nights, I decided to take a break and escape to the wilderness. A friend of mine had recommended this cabin, a place nestled deep in the woods about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The location was remote, perfect for some time away from the world. I had planned on being there for 5 days. The cabin was supposed to be a simple, no-frills kind of place, built for those who wanted to disconnect completely. It didn't have electricity, but there was a wood stove for heat and a small propane-powered fridge. There was a small lake nearby, surrounded by trees that had begun to show their autumn colors. It sounded like the perfect place to recharge. The drive there was scenic but also unsettling. The farther I went, the fewer signs of life I saw. Small towns were scattered here and there, but they were all quiet and almost deserted. As I drove deeper into the woods, the path became more of a dirt trail than an actual road. I passed through dense trees that blocked most of the sunlight, and the whole place had an eerie stillness to it. It felt like the world around me was holding its breath. Eventually, I reached the cabin. It was everything I expected. A small, weathered building made of dark wood, with a slanted roof and a porch that sagged slightly. There was a small shed off to the side, and the lake could be seen just beyond the trees. I parked the car, grabbed my bags, and made my way inside. The interior was simple but cozy. A wood stove sat in the center of the room, and there were a few mismatched chairs around an old wooden table. The walls were lined with bookshelves, though most of the books looked like they hadn't been touched in years. A small window looked out over the lake, which was now hidden behind the thickening fog. The silence inside was overwhelming, almost like it had a weight to it. I started a fire in the stove, unpacked my things, and settled in for the evening. The air outside was chilly, and the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees. It felt like the cabin was in the eye of a storm, as if the world outside was becoming more wild, while I was enclosed in this little haven of warmth and solitude. That night, I tried to sleep, but something about the place kept me awake. It wasn't just the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old cabin. There was something else, a faint noise just beyond the edge of my hearing. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps outside, or a branch scraping against the window. At first, I brushed it off as the wind or an animal, but as the night wore on, the sounds seemed too deliberate, too intentional. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the wind outside like a constant rush of water in my ears. After a while, I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and everything was fine. Yet, the unease remained. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of birds calling from the trees. The fog had lifted, and sunlight filtered through the trees in pale beams. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic. I made coffee and sat on the porch, enjoying the stillness. The world seemed to have reset overnight, as if it had forgiven me for my restless night. I decided to take a walk around the lake. The path was overgrown, but it was still easy enough to follow. The ground was damp with morning dew, and the air had that crisp, fresh quality that comes with being so far from civilization. The forest around me was thick, but I didn't feel scared, just isolated, as if I were the only one left in the world. As I walked, I noticed something strange. There was an odd marking on one of the trees near the water's edge. It looked like someone had carved a symbol into the bark, a circle with a line through the middle, almost like an old, forgotten language. I stepped closer to inspect it, but the closer I got, the more I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. I shrugged it off as some weird, random marking left by a hiker or someone else who had come through, but it was hard to ignore the growing sense of unease. I hurried back to the cabin and decided to spend the rest of the day inside, reading the books on the shelves and getting acquainted with the place. That night, the sounds outside returned, the same rustling and scraping, almost as if something or someone was moving around the cabin. This time, I didn't ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight, pulled on my jacket, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was thick with fog again, and the trees stood like dark silhouettes against the pale glow of the moon. The sounds came from the woods, just beyond the clearing. I stood there for a long moment trying to make sense of it. There was no wind, and the night was eerily still, but I could hear something moving, slow and deliberate. I shone the flashlight toward the trees, but the beam only pierced the fog for a few feet before it disappeared into the gloom. My heart began to race. The rational part of my mind told me it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the other part of me, the part that had started to feel like it wasn't alone, didn't believe that. I waited for a few more minutes, the only sounds now being my own breathing and the occasional rustle from the woods. Nothing emerged, and eventually, I went back inside, but sleep didn't come easy. The feeling of being watched lingered, and every creak of the cabin seemed amplified in the silence of the night. The next day, I made the decision to stay inside, avoiding the lake and the forest altogether. I read through some of the old books on the shelves and tried to distract myself. But the quiet started to get to me. It was too quiet. The only sounds I heard were my own movements and the crackling of the fire. It wasn't until the third night that things took a darker turn. I woke up to a loud bang coming from the back of the cabin. It sounded like something heavy had struck the wall, and it startled me out of my sleep. I immediately sat up in bed, heart pounding. I listened, but all I could hear was the wind howling through the trees and the creaking of the old cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I was 34 when I took the trip. It was late October 2021. My name is Brian Mercer. I'm a freelance photographer, mostly doing work for real estate and nature magazines. I'd been living in Spokane, Washington for a few years by then, and I'd gotten into a habit of doing solo trips out to remote places whenever I felt burned out from editing and deadlines. That year, the burnout hit harder than usual. I had just wrapped up back-to-back contracts for 3 real estate firms and had barely stepped outside in weeks. I found the cabin listing on a website that hosts lesser-known rentals, especially off-grid types. It wasn't Airbnb, more niche. The place was on private land near Coldwater Lake, just southwest of Mount St. Helens. It was advertised as a true solitude experience, with no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no neighbors for miles. The listing said it had solar panels for basic power and a well with a hand pump. The owner, a guy named Dennis, had a bunch of reviews from people who stayed there over the years. No red flags. I booked it for 6 nights. I left Spokane early on a Sunday morning. The drive took me about 6 hours with a few stops for gas and food. By the time I got close to the property, the road had narrowed to a winding gravel trail lined with tall pines. The elevation increased gradually, and the air turned crisp. I rolled down the window and took it in. It smelled like wet bark and dry leaves. My favorite kind of air. The last part of the road was barely a road at all, just 2 narrow tire paths in the dirt. I followed the email directions exactly, past an old metal gate left open, and finally saw the cabin tucked between 2 steep ridges, maybe 100 yards back from the lake's edge. It was surrounded by evergreens on all sides, dense and dark, except in one direction where the water reflected the pale gray sky. The cabin itself was older than I expected, but solid. A-frame style with a small front porch, weathered wooden siding, and a metal chimney poking through the top. There was a steel fire pit off to the side with a few damp logs stacked nearby. Everything looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. That was fine with me. I wanted quiet, and that's what I got. Inside, the cabin had a single room with a loft above. The main floor had a wood stove, a cot with thick wool blankets, a table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchen with a propane stove and a hand-pumped sink. The fridge was a cooler box that drained into a bucket. No plumbing, no thermostat, no insulation. Just wood, nails, and space. The loft had a thin mattress and a dusty window that looked out toward the ridge. By the time I got settled and stacked my camera gear by the table, it was late afternoon. I didn't feel like shooting anything yet. I took a walk down to the lake instead, watching the clouds drift low over the water. The silence out there was heavier than I expected. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence where your ears ring and you notice every movement in the trees. I stood there for a while, letting the calm dig into me. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the wood stove, heated some canned soup, and read a paperback until the warmth made me drowsy. I slept in the loft. The mattress was stiff and smelled like old pine, but I was tired enough not to care. I fell asleep to the sound of wind brushing against the siding. The second day, I started shooting. I walked the perimeter of the lake with my camera, stopping to photograph moss-covered stumps, ripples in the water, and clusters of red and gold leaves still clinging to their branches. I didn't see another person all day, not even a distant boat or a parked truck. It was total isolation. I liked it. That night, I was sitting outside by the fire pit around 8 p.m. I hadn't used it yet, just sitting on the edge with a headlamp on, editing photos on my laptop until the battery died. The temperature had dropped fast after sundown. My breath came out in little clouds. The trees around the clearing were black outlines now. I remember hearing something then, not close, not loud, but definitely out of place. It was a faint metallic clink, like a tool knocking against another, maybe a hammer or wrench. It came from somewhere up the ridge behind the cabin. I looked up instinctively, but all I saw was darkness. The ridge rose sharply about 150 feet behind the cabin and disappeared into heavy forest. No trails up that way, at least not marked ones. I listened for a while, but the sound didn't repeat. I told myself it was nothing. Could have been a branch falling onto a rock or something shifting in the cold. That area used to have logging operations decades ago. Maybe old junk was still up there. I turned in early that night, a little uneasy, but not enough to ruin the trip. The next day, I shot more photos in the opposite direction, trying to get a better angle on the ridge and the lake. I didn't think much about the noise from the night before until I found something strange while hiking back. About 30 yards uphill behind the cabin, I saw a narrow indentation in the ground, mostly covered by ferns and rotting leaves. It wasn't a trail exactly, but it looked like something had been regularly moving through there, flattening the plants in a straight line up the slope. Curious, I followed it for maybe 10 minutes until the incline got too steep and the brush too thick. I didn't find anything obvious. No shack, no campsite, nothing fresh. Still, the track was odd. Too narrow and too consistent to be an animal trail. It looked methodical. I made a mental note and turned back. That night, the sound came again. Same metallic clinking, same location. This time it lasted longer, maybe 5 or 6 faint taps in a row. I froze on the porch, ears straining. Then silence again. No footsteps, no voices, just that strange sound echoing off the trees and then nothing. I didn't sleep well. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was camping illegally on the ridge. Maybe a hunter was setting up a blind. Maybe it was just old junk shifting as the temperature dropped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was up there moving around, watching, maybe. On the 4th day, I hiked around the ridge, trying to come at it from the west side where the incline wasn't so bad. I had my camera, a knife, and a pair of binoculars. I wasn't looking for trouble, just answers. The forest was dense, and the terrain rough. Fallen logs, thorny bushes, and loose rocks made it slow going. About halfway up, I found something that made my stomach flip. It was a tree, or rather, what someone had done to it. The trunk had been shaved flat on one side, and into the exposed wood, someone had carved dozens of straight lines, all parallel, all perfectly spaced. They weren't words or symbols, just lines. Rows and rows of them like tally marks but with no grouping. It must have taken hours. The bark shavings were still on the ground, pale and curling. It was recent. I backed off, suddenly aware of how quiet the woods were again. No birds, no insects, just wind and leaves. I didn't go higher. I turned around and got back to the cabin before dark. That night, I stayed inside, locked the door, even though the listing had said there was no real need for it. I kept the fire small and the lights off. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside, slow, deliberate, crunching the rocks softly, like someone trying not to be noticed. They circled the cabin once, then nothing. I waited, clutching my knife, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't go to the window. I didn't want to see. By dawn, the footsteps were gone. No knock, no attempt to break in. Just a slow, quiet circle and silence. When I finally stepped outside that morning, I found one thing out of place. A single boot print, deep and wide, in the soft dirt behind the cabin. Too big to be mine. too fresh to be old. That was the turning point. I packed my gear and loaded the car. I didn't care if I had 2 nights left. I was done. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The battery was dead. I tried again. Nothing. Not even a click. I popped the hood, checked the cables, everything looked fine. No obvious damage. I walked back to the cabin and tried to calm down. I didn't have cell service. The nearest road was a 2-hour hike downhill. I had enough food and water, but the idea of staying another night after what I'd seen, what I'd heard, was unbearable. I decided to hike out. I packed a bag with essentials, left a note in case someone found the cabin, and locked up. I left around 10 a.m., following the gravel path back down the hill. About an hour into the hike, I heard something behind me. Not close, not loud, just the unmistakable sound of footsteps on dry leaves. I stopped. They stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then I started walking again. They followed. This continued for almost a mile. Every time I stopped, the sound stopped. When I moved, it resumed, always at the edge of hearing. I never saw anyone. The forest was too thick. By the time I reached the gate at the bottom of the property, the sounds had stopped. The rest of the way to the highway was I'm writing this down because I've realized I never want to go back to a place like that again. Not just that cabin, but the whole idea of being out there alone. I used to think I needed isolation to think straight. I thought it would help me reset, clear my mind. But after that weekend at Split Birch cabin, I learned that some things are better dealt with among people. Back in 2021, I was 34, living in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I had a job in software, freelance stuff mostly, so I could work from anywhere. I had gone through a rough year, lost my dad to a heart attack in February, and then a few months later, my relationship ended after 5 years. I needed a break from everything, and being around people just made it worse. Everyone had advice, but none of it felt helpful. That fall, I rented a small off-grid cabin in upstate New York, about 4 hours north of Albany. It was tucked away in the foothills of the Adirondacks, not far from Lake Harris, but not near any tourist trail either. The listing described it as perfect for solo retreats, solar power, a gravity-fed water system, and a wood stove for heat. It was surrounded by forest, with no cell signal and no neighbors for at least 3 miles. The nearest town, Newcomb, had a population under 500. The owner was an older guy named Ron who had converted an old hunting shack into something more livable. He met me in town at a diner parking lot, handed me a printed map, showed me where to turn off the highway, and then just said to follow the dirt path until I saw the split birch tree. The cabin would be just behind it. The drive from the diner to the cabin took nearly 40 minutes, the last stretch crawling along a barely visible trail. When I finally saw that forked birch tree, I was relieved. The cabin sat about 20 feet behind it, weathered pine siding, a tin roof that had seen better days, and one small window on each side. It didn't look like much, but it was solid. One room, a small porch, a fire pit, and an outhouse maybe 30 yards into the woods. It was late October, cold enough to see your breath in the mornings, but the snow hadn't started yet. The woods were mostly bare, the leaves having just dropped, so everything had that dead quiet that only fall brings. I liked it at first, the stillness, the kind of silence you only get when you're miles from anything. The first day, I unpacked, stacked some firewood beside the stove, set up my sleeping bag on the built-in cot, and made a quick dinner from canned soup. I had brought enough food for a week, mostly dry stuff, cans, a few fresh vegetables I planned to eat early. There was a manual pump for water in a small shed beside the cabin, and the tap ran cold and clean. That first night, I sat out on the porch under a thick blanket, sipping instant coffee from a thermos, listening to the wind. I remember thinking how right this felt. Just me and the woods. No phone, no one to talk to. I fell asleep quickly, the kind of sleep that hits you hard when there's no background noise. Just the creak of trees and the occasional rustle of animals. The second day, I hiked around the area to get my bearings. I didn't have GPS, but I had a compass and the printed map Ron had given me. I stayed within a mile of the cabin, following some game trails, checking out the streams. At one point, I thought I heard a low engine rumble, maybe an ATV or chainsaw, but it was so faint it could have been anything. I chalked it up to sound traveling strangely in the forest. That night, I woke up twice to noises outside. Sharp ones like a stick snapping, then something dragging across the ground. I sat up, heart thumping, and reached for my flashlight. The stove had burned low, and the cabin was cold. I peeked out the window and scanned the woods, but the beam caught nothing but trunks and shadows. Probably a raccoon or deer. I wasn't really scared. Not yet, but I did start locking the door after that, even though it was just a simple latch. By the third day, things began to feel a little off. I found boot prints in the dirt about 10 yards behind the cabin. They weren't mine. I had a very distinct tread on my hiking boots, and these were different. Heavier, wider set. I told myself it could have been Ron checking up on the place, though it didn't make much sense for him to hike in that far just to snoop around the back. Still, I had no real reason to be alarmed, so I let it go. That afternoon, while chopping wood, I noticed something strange further out, about 50 yards through the trees, something reflective glinting on the ground. I walked over and found a crumpled energy drink can, partially buried in the leaves. It wasn't mine. I hadn't brought any drinks like that. The label was faded, but the aluminum looked recent, no rust, no weathering. I carried it back and tossed it into my trash bag. Probably some hiker from earlier in the season, I figured, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby recently. That night, I woke up again, this time to a low knocking. Not on the cabin, but faint, rhythmic thuds. I sat up slowly, waited, then heard them again. Not fast, not urgent, just steady, like something brushing or tapping. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed my flashlight again, and slowly opened the door. The woods were pitch dark, and colder than it had been the nights before. I stepped onto the porch and stood still, listening. Then I heard it, a dragging sound. Long, slow, maybe 30 feet to the left of the cabin. I shone the light in that direction and caught something moving just behind a cluster of trees. I froze. The light only reached so far, and whatever was there was just at the edge of it. A tall shape, maybe a person, maybe a deer, but it was standing upright. Then it ducked out of view. I backed into the cabin, closed the door, and sat against it for the next hour, flashlight in hand, until the sky began to lighten through the windows. I didn't sleep again that night. That morning, I walked out to the spot where I'd seen the shape. There were tracks, boot prints again, and a strange drag mark running alongside them, like someone had been pulling a heavy bag. I followed them for a short distance until they veered off down a hill and disappeared into a shallow creek bed. The water had disturbed the prints, and I lost the trail. I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to admit defeat. I wasn't hurt, and technically nothing had happened. I told myself maybe it was a hunter or trapper passing through. Still, I started carrying my camping hatchet with me everywhere after that. That afternoon, I made a bigger fire than usual and sat outside late, just watching the woods. Every sound made me twitch. The wind rattling dead leaves, the thump of acorns falling, even the call of a barred owl. When I finally turned in, I wedged a chair under the doorknob, just to be sure. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, then a scrape, like something being dragged across the wood floor outside. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stayed there, eyes fixed on the door, listening. Then I heard the faintest click. Metal on metal. The latch. Whoever was out there tried to open the door. I gripped the hatchet, heart thudding so loud I thought it would give me away. But the latch held. A few minutes passed, and then I heard the steps retreating. Not running, just slow, steady steps crunching through the leaves, growing fainter, then gone. When the sun came up, I stepped out, hatchet in hand. The porch had scuff marks, long, wide grooves like something had been dragged across it. And there, sitting right at the edge, was a deer carcass. Its throat was slashed, but not cleanly, more like ripped open. Its legs had been broken. It had clearly been moved post-mortem. There were boot prints around it, fresh ones, deeper than before. Whoever left it wanted me to find it. That was enough. I packed everything in under 10 minutes. Food, water, sleeping bag. I didn't care if I left anything behind. I sprinted to the car, about a quarter-mile up the path where I had to park it because the trail was too rough. I didn't look back. The car started without issue, and I drove like hell down the trail, bumping over rocks and ruts. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved road. Then I just kept going straight through to Albany, where I got a motel room and collapsed on the bed, fully clothed, still shaking. I called Ron from a gas station the next day, told him I left early and that I'd mail back the cabin key. I didn't explain. He didn't ask. I never went back. Never found out who was out there or why they were watching me or why they left that deer. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office, but without any damage, without a face. There wasn't much they could do. They said it was probably a poacher messing around. Maybe, but the way it all unfolded, it felt personal. Like I was being watched from the moment I arrived. It's been 4 years now. I still think about it sometimes, especially in the fall. I still hike, still camp sometimes, but never alone and never that deep in. People talk about how peaceful the woods are, but peace can turn on you real fast when you're alone and someone else is out there. Someone who knows the land better than you, who doesn't want you there. That weekend changed how I look at isolation. I went out there to escape people. What I found was a reminder that the scariest... My name is Evan Reed. I was 31 when this happened, summer of 2017. I lived in Spokane, Washington at the time, and I worked in maintenance for a community college. Not the worst job. Paid okay, quiet work. I'd just gotten out of a long relationship back then. For years with a woman I thought I'd marry, but things fell apart slowly, then all at once. You know how it goes. I needed time to clear my head, so I figured I'd do a solo trip. I'd camped plenty as a kid, and I'd done some solo trips before, though none more than a weekend. This time, I wanted something longer, just me and silence. I rented a small, off-grid cabin for 2 weeks up in northeastern Washington, near Kleville National Forest. The cabin sat way back in the woods, about 5 miles from the nearest dirt road. You had to park your car at a clearing, then hike in with your gear. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a rain barrel, and a composting toilet out back. The cabin was owned by some older guy named Murray, retired forestry worker. He built the place himself back in the 80s. I found it listed on some backwoods rental site. The pictures made it look perfect. Just a simple wooden structure with thick forest all around and a small creek nearby. I got there on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. It had been a dry summer, so the trail leading to the cabin was dusty and cracked. It took me nearly 2 hours to haul all my stuff in. 2 trips with my gear, cooler, tools, food, and a small solar charger I brought for my phone, though I knew there was no signal out there. When I finally stepped into the cabin, the heat hit me right away. It was stifling inside, and the windows had all been shut for who knows how long. Dust floated in the light beams cutting through the small front window. I opened every window and propped the door for airflow. The place was simple, just a twin bed, a table, a shelf with some old paperbacks, a few pots and pans, and a little wood stove in the corner. There was a logbook on the table with names and short entries going back 20 years. I flipped through a few. Most people had only stayed a couple nights. A few had left little hand-drawn maps of good hiking trails nearby. One guy had scribbled a whole page about watching a bobcat down by the creek. After settling in, I spent that first evening just unwinding. I cooked some pasta on my camp stove outside and sat on a log watching the sky turn orange. I remember the quiet, that kind of quiet you only get way out in the woods, where there's no hum of cars or appliances, just the occasional bird call, the wind through the trees, and your own breathing. The first night passed without anything strange. I slept hard, too hard actually. Woke up drenched in sweat around 2 a.m. because I forgot how warm those old sleeping bags get in summer. I got up, splashed water from the rain barrel on my face, then went back to bed. Took me a while to fall asleep again. Every little rustle outside the cabin set my ears up. A branch snapping, leaves crunching, normal wood stuff, but when you're alone, even a raccoon sounds like a person. The second day, I hiked around and found that creek maybe half a mile south of the cabin. The water was low but cold and clean. I filled up a few bottles and ran them through the filter I brought. I spotted deer tracks in the mud. Some small ones too, maybe a fawn. I also found what looked like a hunting blind up in a tree about 20 minutes from the cabin. It was old, falling apart, but it had good sight lines over a wide slope. I climbed up just to see, and when I looked back the way I'd come, I realized how easy it was to get turned around. Everything looked the same, green and brown and still. That evening, I built a small fire in the pit outside and cooked sausages. Sat by the fire until it was just glowing coals. I watched the trees sway under the moonlight and felt that calm again. I remember thinking I could really spend a lot more time out there. Maybe I'd come back in the fall when it was cooler. The weird stuff didn't start until the third night. I woke up around 1:30 a.m. to a noise outside. Something fast and light, like feet moving across the leaves. Not a thud, more like a patter. I sat up, heart already going. I listened hard, holding my breath. There it was again. A quick rustle, then nothing. Now, I'm not the paranoid type, but I'm not stupid either. I knew animals came around cabins, raccoons, maybe even a bear if you left food out. But I'd been careful. Food was stored in a cooler, locked and weighted. Trash tied up and hung in a tree away from the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside barefoot, flashlight in hand. I swept it around. Still nothing. Then I noticed something odd. The firewood I'd stacked on the side of the cabin had been moved. Not all of it, just enough that it looked wrong. 2 or 3 pieces had been taken from the middle of the stack and placed on the ground, a few feet away, like someone had pulled them out and then dropped them there. That's not something an animal would do. I knelt down and looked at the dirt. I thought I saw a print. Maybe a shoe, maybe just where the wood had fallen. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat inside with the flashlight on and my multi-tool in hand, listening. By morning, I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe I'd stacked the wood wrong and it fell. Maybe a deer kicked it. Still, I felt weird. I did a big loop hike that day to clear my head. Took about 4 hours through some rocky ridges to the north and back through thicker pine forest. Found some elk droppings and a weird metal box half buried in the dirt. Just an old toolbox, rusted shut. Probably a hunter left it there years ago. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat inside and read an old paperback someone had left behind. Some Western from the 70s. Around midnight, I turned in, but I didn't sleep well. At 3:12 a.m., I remember because I checked my watch, I heard tapping. Not knocking, tapping. On the side of the cabin. Soft, like someone drumming fingers on the wood. I froze. The sound moved. Tap, tap. Then a few seconds of silence. Then again on the back wall. Then the side window. I didn't move. I just listened, every muscle locked. Then nothing. No footsteps. No crunching leaves. Just silence. I stayed like that for an hour until the sun started to rise. That morning I checked around the cabin. No tracks, no marks. But again, something small was off. My pack, the one I'd left just inside the door, was now sitting just outside, propped up against the cabin wall. I didn't move it. No animal would have dragged it like that and not torn into it. I started thinking about heading out early. I had about 8 days left in the rental, but I started making plans. I wasn't scared exactly, just uneasy, like someone was watching the place. I hiked out to where the trail meets the clearing where my car was. I didn't see anyone, no other cars, but I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A pile of stones had been stacked next to the trail. Perfect little stack about knee-high, like a cairn but recent. Moss hadn't grown on them yet, and I didn't remember it being there when I came in. I picked one of the stones up. Underneath, I saw something dark, a scrap of fabric, navy blue. I pulled it out and found it was a piece of synthetic jacket, like from a windbreaker, torn. I didn't know what to make of it, but it put me on edge. That night, I didn't cook, just ate a protein bar and stayed inside. Kept my light off, just sat by the window looking out into the woods. I thought I saw movement a few times, shadows between trees. Could have been animals. Could have been nothing. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed everything. I made 2 fast trips to the car, heart pounding every time I left the cabin. I didn't hear or see anything, but the woods felt charged, like the air before a storm. When I got back to the car on my second trip, I found something that made my knees go weak. On the hood of my Subaru was a handprint. Not a smudge, not dirt, a full, clear print made in ash, like someone with dirty hands had pressed their palm flat on the metal. It wasn't there an hour earlier. I loaded up the last of my stuff and drove out without looking back. I reported it to the county sheriff's office when I got back to town. They said they'd send someone to check it out. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I never heard back. 2 weeks later, I got a text from the rental site. The listing for the cabin had been removed. No explanation, just gone. I still think about it sometimes. Not every day, but enough. Someone was out there, not some crazy killer or forest spirit. Just a person, watching, testing, waiting maybe. And I think if I'd stayed one more night, I might have found out why. Or I wouldn't be telling this story at all. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a quick break from the stress of everyday life, a chance to get away from work, the city, and everything that felt like it was constantly on top of me. Just me, my backpack, and a cabin tucked away in the woods. The kind of place you'd find in the middle of nowhere. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just nature and quiet. I had found the cabin online, buried deep in some obscure travel blog, and it seemed perfect. A rustic retreat in the woods, close enough to a town for supplies, but far enough to feel like I was completely disconnected from everything. The photos on the listing were nice. The cabin looked sturdy. The surroundings looked peaceful, just what I needed. I drove up on a Friday evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the winding road. The air smelled different here, fresh, crisp, almost piney. The kind of clean air you can only get far from any major city. The road to the cabin was more of a dirt trail than anything, barely wide enough for my car to fit through. The last couple of miles had been rough. Potholes, branches hanging low, the road barely visible in the fading light. But when I finally turned onto the long gravel driveway leading to the cabin, I felt a sense of relief. The cabin itself was small, with a slanted roof and wooden siding that had clearly weathered many seasons. It wasn't much, just one room, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. The windows were large, offering views of the forest that stretched out in every direction. There was a porch with a couple of old rocking chairs, and a woodpile stacked neatly beside the cabin. It looked like the kind of place someone might retreat to after a lifetime of hard work, a place to relax and unwind. Exactly what I was looking for. I unloaded my car, bringing in my bag, food, and a couple of books I had been meaning to read. The inside of the cabin was cozy, but old. There was a heavy wood stove in the corner, an old-fashioned refrigerator that made strange noises when it kicked on, and mismatched furniture. The floors creaked underfoot, and the wooden beams in the ceiling were exposed, giving the cabin an almost rustic charm. There were a couple of pictures on the walls, some of the landscapes surrounding the cabin, others of family members I didn't recognize. The place had a strange smell. Not bad, but earthy, like old wood and dust. At first, I thought it was just the oldness of the place. But as I moved around, I started to notice something else, something more subtle. It was like the air had a thickness to it, almost like the cabin was holding on to something. Maybe it was just my imagination. I'd been in cabins like this before, in similar places, and none of them had ever felt off. But there was something about this one that didn't sit right. I shrugged it off. I was tired from the drive, so I decided to relax, unpack a bit, and have some dinner. I started a fire in the wood stove, then pulled out a can of chili from my bag. The cabin's kitchen was simple, but it had everything I needed. A small stove, a microwave, and the basics, plates, cups, utensils. Nothing fancy, but that was fine. I wasn't here for luxury. As the fire crackled and the smell of the chili filled the cabin, I sat down at the small wooden table near the window. It was dark outside now, and I could only make out vague shapes of trees and the occasional movement of an animal or bird. The quiet was deafening. Not even the sound of cars or other people. Just silence. I wasn't used to this level of isolation. Back home, I lived in the city, surrounded by constant noise. It was a weird feeling to not hear anything, to not see any lights in the distance. It was just me, the cabin, and the woods. I finished my meal, cleaned up, and sat on the couch with a book. I tried to read for a while, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, or that there was something out there moving just beyond the trees. Every now and then, a branch would creak or the wind would rustle through the leaves, but nothing too unsettling. Still, the air felt dense, and the quiet was starting to make my skin crawl. Around 9:30 p.m., I decided to turn in for the night. The bed was simple, a queen-sized mattress with a heavy quilt on top. I left the light on for a while, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling. It felt old, as if it was alive in some way, groaning and shifting with the weight of time. I tried to ignore it, but it kept pulling my focus. The longer I lay there, the more I began to notice things. Small noises, the creak of the floorboards, the rattle of the windows as the wind picked up. I eventually managed to drift off to sleep, but it wasn't the peaceful sleep I'd been hoping for. I woke up a few times during the night, feeling like I was being watched. There was a weight to the stillness around me, a pressure that didn't feel natural. I told myself it was just nerves, nothing more. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of birds chirping outside. The sun had barely risen, but the light creeping through the curtains was soft and warm. I got up and stretched, still feeling a little unsettled but determined to shake off the odd feelings from the night before. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat down on the porch, and watched the sun climb higher into the sky. The day was clear, the air fresh and cool. For a while, it was easy to believe that this place was just what I needed. But as the day wore on, something started to change. Little things, mostly. I noticed that the wind had picked up, whipping through the trees in gusts. The kind of wind that made the branches groan and creak, but it wasn't particularly unusual for a wooded area. What was strange was that it seemed to be coming from all directions at once. Normally, wind has a direction. It comes from the north or the south or wherever. But this wind, it didn't seem to have any clear origin. It felt unnatural. I went for a walk around the property, thinking maybe it would help clear my head. The cabin was surrounded by a thick forest, with only a narrow dirt path leading off into the trees. I followed it for a while, trying to get a sense of the land. The woods were dense, the trees tall and imposing, but there was something about the forest that felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but unsettling. The way the trees grew too close together, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist even when there was no reason for them to do so. I kept walking until I came across a small clearing, just a few hundred feet away from the cabin. The ground was covered in moss, and there was a rock outcrop at one end, offering a nice view of the woods beyond. I sat down on one of the rocks, trying to calm my mind, but it wasn't long before I noticed something strange. A line of tracks running through the center of the clearing. They were fresh, the dirt still disturbed, but they didn't look like any animal tracks I was familiar with. They were too large, too deep, and they weren't spaced out evenly like the tracks of an animal. They were irregular, almost like someone had walked through the clearing, dragging their feet. I stood up, suddenly feeling more uneasy than I had since I arrived. I glanced around, but there was no sign of anyone, no sign of anything that could have left those tracks. I turned back toward the cabin, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the wind had picked up again, stronger than before. It howled through the trees, making the cabin groan. I went inside and locked the door behind me, not because I thought I was in immediate danger, but because the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I tried to shake it off and went about my day, but something about the place kept gnawing at me. That evening, I decided to turn in early. I didn't want to think about the strange tracks, the unsettling wind, or the feeling of being watched. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the noise outside seemed louder. The wind wasn't just howling now, it was slamming into the cabin, rattling the windows like someone was trying to break in. The sound was relentless, like the storm was trying to get in, trying to drag me out into the woods. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm rage outside. Then it stopped, just like that. Silence. I felt like the entire world had gone still. Even the wind. The eerie, unnatural quiet that followed was worse than the storm itself. I couldn't handle it. My mind was racing, and I needed to know what was going on. I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but something told me I couldn't just ignore it anymore. The cabin was completely still, the kind of stillness that was almost suffocating. I opened the door to the porch and stepped outside, shining the flashlight around the area. There was nothing, no animals, no signs of anything. But as I moved the light toward the edge of the property, I saw something, a shadow, moving in the trees, slowly, like it was watching me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't move like any animal I knew. It was too deliberate, too human. It was just a figure, standing there, barely visible in the shadows. I couldn't take my eyes off it. My stomach churned, and my whole... My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 37 now, but this happened 10 years ago, back in 2015. I was living in Portland at the time, working as a freelance photojournalist. I'd been going nonstop for months. Between assignments, editing, and chasing invoices, I was burnt out. I needed a break, something that would put me off-grid for a while. Not a beach or some fancy hotel, but real solitude. Somewhere quiet, somewhere I could reset. That's when I found the listing. It was on a tiny vacation rental site, not one of the big ones. A small, plain-looking cabin up in northeastern Washington, near Kleville. The photos didn't show much. One exterior shot, a few trees around it, a wood stove inside. No hot tub, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. It was perfect. It was cheap too, almost suspiciously cheap. But I figured it was because it was so isolated. The owner only messaged me once, just to confirm the dates. No long contracts or lists of rules. Just a message. Cabins stocked with wood and water. No reception. Nearest town's 40 minutes south. Bring what you need. I packed enough groceries for 2 weeks, loaded my old Subaru with gear, and made the 7-hour drive from Portland to Kleville. From there, it was another 40 minutes along a badly maintained forest road. It was late September, right before the cold really starts to settle in. The leaves had turned, the air was dry, and the sky was a dull gray. The cabin sat in a clearing maybe 2 acres wide, surrounded by thick pine and fir trees. No neighboring houses, no power lines. Just trees and sky and that old wooden structure. It was small, maybe 25 by 25 feet, with dark, weathered siding and a rusty tin roof. There was a little porch with a single step, and beside the cabin, maybe 30 yards back, was a shed. That shed would become important, but I didn't know that yet. The inside was simple. One big room with a wood stove in the center, a small kitchenette, a table with 2 chairs, and a twin bed in the corner. No electricity, no plumbing. There was a rain barrel behind the cabin and a pit toilet about 15 yards into the woods. It wasn't luxury, but it was what I wanted. The first few days were peaceful. I spent them reading, chopping wood, walking through the forest. I took a few photos for myself, nothing professional. Just the trees, the changing leaves, the cabin in the morning light. I'd never felt so disconnected from the world, and I mean that in the best way. It was on the 4th night that I noticed something strange. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I'd been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke up. No noise, no nightmare. Just that feeling, that something isn't quite right. I sat up in bed, and the first thing I noticed was the stove. It had gone out. That wasn't too weird. Sometimes the wood burns faster than you expect. But then I heard it. A sound from outside. Not close, far back. Maybe at the edge of the clearing. It was subtle, like a soft scraping or dragging noise. Came in short bursts, like something being pulled along the ground. I held my breath and listened. It went quiet. I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer or a raccoon, maybe. I had seen both near the cabin. Still, I got up and lit a candle. I didn't go outside, though. I stood by the window and looked out, but the glass was old and wavy, and the moon wasn't out. Couldn't see a thing. I stayed up another hour, staring out the window, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I went out to look around. I checked the clearing and the edge of the woods. I didn't see anything at first, but when I walked toward the shed, I noticed something strange in the grass. A line, a narrow track like something heavy had been dragged. It started a few feet from the shed and led into the trees. I followed it maybe 20 feet before it disappeared. The ground there was firmer, less grass, but the track definitely started near the shed. I hadn't gone into the shed yet. I figured it was just for tools or firewood, but now I was curious. The door had a latch, not locked, just hooked. I opened it slowly. The smell hit me first. Dust, old wood, and something faintly sour. Inside was dark, but enough light came in through a small window to see. There wasn't much in there. A broken wheelbarrow, some rusted tools, an old tarp, and a large plastic barrel. That's what caught my eye. It was white with a blue lid, like the kind used for chemicals or rainwater. It was stained on the outside, like something had leaked from it at one point. I walked over and knocked on it. Solid. I tried to lift the lid, but it was sealed tight, duct taped around the edge. I didn't want to mess with it too much. Could have been anything, waste oil, pesticide, whatever. Still, it gave me a weird feeling. I left the shed and didn't go back in. That night, I brought the hatchet inside the cabin. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was uneasy. That dragging noise hadn't been nothing. And the shed, it just didn't sit right with me. Around midnight, I woke up again. This time, I knew what had woken me. There was a noise right outside the cabin. Not at the edge of the clearing. Not in the woods. Right outside. I held my breath and listened. Slow footsteps. On the porch. 1, 2. Then the creak of the wooden step. My heart was pounding. The cabin door was latched, but it was old. No deadbolt, just a hook latch and a piece of wood jammed under the handle. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. I didn't dare move. Then finally I heard the creak again. The step. Then footsteps moving away this time. Soft, deliberate, toward the back of the cabin, toward the shed. I sat in that bed until dawn. When the sun came up, I went outside. There were marks in the dirt on the step. Indents. Not clear footprints, just enough to know someone had been there. I walked to the back of the cabin. The shed door was open. I know I'd latched it. Inside, the barrel was gone. Not moved. Gone. I stood there, trying to understand what I was seeing. The barrel was heavy. I tried lifting it. No way it had been taken by an animal. And even if it had leaked out, there would have been a stain. But the spot where it sat was clean. That day, I packed up. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going and stayed up with my back to the wall, holding the hatchet. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. I heard the dragging again, closer this time, but I didn't go to the window. I didn't move. When the sun rose, I left everything but the essentials and drove back to Kleville. I stopped at the sheriff's office and told them what had happened. I showed them the photos I'd taken of the shed, the drag marks, everything. They didn't say much, just took my statement and told me they'd check it out. I never heard back. A few months later, I got curious and searched the address online. The listing was gone. Nothing about it anywhere. Not on the site, not on Google. It was like it never existed. Years passed. I tried to forget about it. Told myself maybe I'd imagined parts of it. Stress, isolation, sleep deprivation. That kind of thing messes with your head. But then, just last year, I got a package. No return address. Inside was a small stack of photos. Old Polaroids, yellowed and faded. All taken in that clearing. The cabin, the shed. But not from the outside. From inside. And in one of them, you could see me, sleeping, in the bed. It was late October, 2021, when I drove out to the northern woods of Maine, just past a place called Tunk Lake. I had taken 2 weeks off from work. I was 33 then, living alone in Portland, working remotely in tech. I'd gotten tired of the noise, the traffic, the same apartment walls. I needed something quieter, slower. I found an old off-grid cabin listed on a site for remote rentals. It was supposed to be peaceful, no cell signal, just a radio and solar panels for lights. It was owned by some old guy who didn't live there anymore. Said he only used it in summers now. The listing showed a small wooden cabin sitting at the edge of a dense forest with a steep ridge in the background. It looked like exactly what I needed. The road up there was rough. I drove a 15-year-old Subaru that rattled every time I hit a pothole, and the last 3 miles were nothing but dirt and loose stone. The air got colder the farther I went. Leaves had already turned, mostly orange and deep red, and the trees looked ready to drop them any day. The cabin was about 20 minutes from the nearest paved road and surrounded by thick trees. There were no neighbors, no signs of other people. Just trees, birds, and the faint sound of wind on the ridge behind the place. It wasn't big. One main room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen setup, a cot in the corner, and a deck that looked out toward the woods. There was a small outhouse behind the cabin, maybe 20 yards away. Water came from a hand pump outside. No fridge, just a big cooler. I brought enough food to last the 2 weeks, dried stuff, canned stuff, and a big container of water in case the pump didn't work. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I'd wake up to the sound of wind in the trees, spend the day walking the woods or reading, chop some firewood, cook basic meals. I didn't hear a single car, didn't see a single plane. It was pure silence except for the birds and the trees. At night, it got quiet in a way that made you feel like the world had been turned off. I noticed the ridge behind the cabin on the first day, just a steep rise covered in trees and large boulders. I didn't climb it at first. It was rocky and steep, and the undergrowth was thick. I figured I'd explore it later, maybe on the weekend. But on the 4th day, I was out collecting fallen branches for the fire when I thought I saw something near the base of the ridge. Just a quick movement. It was far away, maybe 100 feet up the slope, partly hidden behind some trees. Could have been a deer or a bird. I didn't think much of it. There were tons of animals around, and the woods were full of movement. But that night, when I was sitting by the fire outside the cabin, I kept glancing up toward the ridge. It was pitch black up there. The trees swayed slowly in the wind, and the shadows looked like they were shifting in small ways. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was being jumpy, city brain not used to pure darkness. I went inside, shut the door, and locked it. I didn't sleep great. I kept waking up to small noises, twigs cracking, something brushing against the cabin wall. I told myself it was wind. The next morning, I decided to climb the ridge. I needed to shake off the paranoia. The slope behind the cabin wasn't too far, maybe a quarter-mile walk, but the incline was steep. I took a thermos of water, wore gloves and boots, and started up around 10 in the morning. It was colder in the shade. The ridge was rockier than I'd thought. Big slabs of granite jutted out at odd angles, and the trees thinned the higher I went. Halfway up, I stopped to catch my breath and looked back toward the cabin. It looked smaller from up there, just a tiny brown square tucked between trees. When I reached the top, I expected a view. I thought maybe I'd see the lake or even the road, but it was just more trees, more rocks. The forest stretched in every direction. But then I noticed something strange about the ground. Just off the ridge, there was a narrow dirt path, like something had been walking the same line over and over. It didn't look like an animal trail. It was too clean, too even. And nearby, tucked under a small overhang of rock, I found what looked like an old hunting blind. It was rough, just a few pieces of plywood leaned against rocks, but inside, there were a couple of beer cans and a rusted folding chair. It looked old, but not ancient, maybe a few years. Someone had spent time there. I didn't stay long. I got an odd feeling standing there, like I was being watched. I hiked back down, took the long way around, and returned to the cabin by early afternoon. For the rest of the day, I kept thinking about the blind. Something about it felt wrong. Who had built it? Why right there, where it overlooked my cabin but nothing else? That night, I made sure to close the curtains before lighting the lanterns. I felt exposed even inside. I didn't sit outside after dark. I didn't want to look up at the ridge again. I kept thinking about how easy it would be for someone to watch me from up there, hidden behind those rocks and trees. I fell asleep with a hatchet next to the cot. The next morning, I found something that made me feel sick. There were footprints in the soft dirt near the fire pit. Human footprints, barefoot. It had rained slightly overnight, just enough to leave the soil damp, and the prints were fresh. They came from the woods, circled the fire pit, and led off toward the ridge. My boots were still where I'd left them, and I hadn't walked barefoot outside at all. I stood there staring at them for a long time. My first thought was maybe a hiker had gotten lost, but no one was out here. I hadn't seen a car in days, no tire tracks on the road in, and who walks barefoot through the woods? I felt a tightening in my chest. I checked my supplies. Everything seemed untouched. I looked around the edge of the cabin. Nothing. No signs of a person. I considered packing up and leaving, but I'd paid for 2 weeks, and I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was an old footprint, and the rain had just brought it out again. I spent that day chopping more firewood and tried to keep busy, but I couldn't relax. I kept checking the tree line, kept listening for movement. That night, I didn't sleep. The following day, I found more prints. This time, they were near the outhouse. Same shape, bare feet, narrow heels, deep impressions. I followed them a short distance, but they vanished into the brush. Whoever it was, they knew how to move through the woods. I decided then I'd leave the next morning. I started packing some gear. I didn't want to be there another night, but I also didn't want to drive the dirt road in the dark. I stayed inside all evening, lantern off. I sat on the cot with my hatchet and waited. I kept listening. Sometime after midnight, I heard something outside. It was faint, just a light crunch of leaves. Then silence. Then another, closer, like someone walking slowly. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there watching the door. The steps stopped. For maybe a full minute, there was nothing. Then I heard a faint tap. Just one, like a fingertip on the wooden wall. I didn't move. I waited. Then another, this time closer to the window. Then silence again. I stayed like that until the sun came up. When it was light, I stepped outside. Nothing was there, but I found something under the window. A small bundle of pine needles tied with string. It looked like it had been placed there deliberately. I don't know why, but it felt like a message. I grabbed my things, loaded the car, and left. I didn't clean up. I didn't leave a note. I just drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. And even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. I drove straight home to Portland. That was the end of it, I thought. But 2 weeks later, I got a letter. No return address. Just my name, no stamp. It had been hand-delivered. Inside was a photo, an old Polaroid. It was a picture of the cabin, but it had been taken from above, from the ridge. And in the picture, I was standing on the deck, staring off into the trees. I never told anyone. I burned the photo. I moved to a new apartment. I don't go into the woods anymore. I still don't know who was up there or why they watched me, but they'd been watching the whole time, and I didn't see them until it was too late. I was 34 when I decided to leave everything behind for a while. I had spent the past 8 years working in advertising in New York City, staring at glowing screens, pitching nonsense to companies I didn't care about. After a particularly brutal month of 14-hour days and sleepless nights, I finally broke. I took unpaid leave and left the city. My plan was simple: disappear for a month and write the book I'd been talking about for years. I found a cabin on a small rental site. It wasn't on Airbnb or any fancy platform, just an old listing with a couple blurry photos and a vague description. Quiet retreat in the Vermont woods. No internet, no cell service, solar power, well water, with stove, 7 miles from town. That was all it said. It was perfect. I packed my car with groceries, my laptop, notebooks, and clothes. I even brought some basic tools and my old hunting knife my grandfather gave me when I was a kid. The cabin was near a small town called Weston, Vermont. I'd never heard of it, but that didn't matter. I wanted to be away from everything. The last few miles of the drive were on a dirt road so narrow that branches scraped against my car on both sides. I kept thinking I'd missed a turn, but eventually the trees opened up just enough to reveal a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It was smaller than I'd expected. One main room with a bed, a small table, and a wood stove. There was a little kitchenette with a gas-powered stove and a small fridge that ran on solar. The bathroom was more like an outhouse attached to the side, but at least it had a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower. The water came from a tank I had to fill manually from a pump near the woodshed. I was excited. I was finally away from everything. The silence was overwhelming the first night. No sirens, no cars, not even planes overhead. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The first few days went exactly as I'd hoped. I woke up early, made coffee on the stove, and wrote until it got dark. I cooked simple meals, read in the evenings by lantern, and went to bed early. There was no signal for my phone, no internet to distract me. I was finally doing what I said I'd do for years, but around the fifth night, something changed. I was sitting at the little table, writing by lantern light, when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a rustle. I assumed it was an animal. There were squirrels all over, and I'd seen a couple deer near the edge of the clearing that morning. But then it happened again, closer this time. A definite, deliberate sound, like a footstep. I froze. I turned off the lantern and waited, listening. My ears adjusted to the silence. I couldn't hear anything for a minute. Then another step, and another. Something was walking around the cabin. I stood quietly and moved toward the window. I couldn't see anything at first. The moon was behind the clouds, and the forest was almost pitch black. But then, near the tree line, I saw a shape, a human shape. Someone was standing there, not moving, just watching. I blinked, looked again. The shape was gone. I stayed up the rest of the night with the lights off. I held my knife and kept glancing out the window every 10 minutes. But I didn't see anything else. In the morning, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was just jumpy. I hadn't spoken to another person in almost a week, and maybe that was messing with my head. I went outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin. I found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing unusual. But that night, it happened again. This time, it started with a scraping sound, like something dragging across the wall of the cabin. I turned off the lantern and waited. It was just past 10 p.m. I hadn't gone to bed yet. The scraping stopped, and I heard the crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate steps. They circled the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there in the dark, holding the knife. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. In the morning, I went outside again and checked the walls. There were faint scratches on the wood, about waist high. Nothing deep, nothing clear, but they hadn't been there before. I started locking the cabin more carefully after that. I kept the knife with me at all times, even inside, and I started sleeping with one ear open, waking at every sound. I thought about leaving, but I was 7 miles from the nearest town, and the road was rough. My car was fine, but I didn't want to run at the first weird noise. I wanted to believe I could stick it out, that this was just paranoia. A few more nights passed without anything. I thought maybe whoever or whatever it was had moved on. But then, I woke up one night to the sound of the door handle turning. I hadn't imagined it. I heard the metal click. Then again. Someone was trying to open the door, slowly, like they didn't want to make noise. I sat up and grabbed my knife. The door was locked, but it wasn't a strong lock, just a single bolt. I waited. The handle stopped moving. Then came the footsteps, slow around the cabin again. Same pattern. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I packed a small bag and walked toward town. I figured I'd call the property owner, maybe get a police check. But a mile down the trail, my phone still had no signal, and the path was covered in fallen branches. It would take hours to get to town on foot, so I went back, I told myself I'd give it one more night. I slept during the day so I could stay awake all night. I turned off all the lights and sat in the corner with a blanket wrapped around me, watching the windows. It was around 1 a.m. when I saw the shape again. This time, it wasn't at the tree line. It was right outside the window, just a silhouette. A man, definitely, standing perfectly still, not doing anything, just watching. I didn't move. I didn't blink. After maybe 5 minutes, he stepped backward and vanished into the dark. That was the last straw. At first light, I packed everything into the car and drove straight to town. It was a tiny place. Weston barely had a gas station. I found the police station, which was really just a small building with a single cruiser out front. I told the officer everything. He listened, nodded, and made a call. Another officer drove back with me to the cabin. We walked the perimeter again. Nothing obvious. No footprints, no signs of a break-in. Then he found something. Behind the cabin, near the woodshed, there was a narrow path I hadn't noticed. It led deeper into the trees. About 50 yards in, we found a small clearing. There were wrappers on the ground, a couple beer cans, and what looked like an old tarp. Someone had been camping there, watching. The officer radioed it in. He said it might have been a squatter, maybe someone living off-grid, or maybe just someone messing with me. Either way, he said I made the right call. I didn't stay. I left that day and never went back. A few weeks later, I got a call. They'd found more signs in the woods, makeshift traps, old food cans, even a journal with strange notes in it. Nothing criminal, just odd. No name, no ID. Whoever it was had vanished. I didn't finish the book. I haven't gone back to the woods since. But sometimes, when I lie in bed at night, I think about that shape standing in the dark, just watching. I think about how quiet the forest was, how easy it would have been for someone to live out there, unnoticed, and how lucky I was to leave when I did. I'm not really the kind of person who writes stuff down, but this one has been sitting in my head for over a year now. I figured it's either write it or keep waking up with my teeth clenched so tight I can barely chew in the morning. This happened in the fall of 2021 in northern Idaho, just south of Sandpoint. I was 34 then, living in Spokane. I'd just gotten out of a rough relationship and had taken time off work, some unpaid leave, to get my head straight. A friend of mine mentioned an old family cabin his uncle had stopped using years ago. It was deep in the forest, not fancy, but stocked with the basics. No rent, just needed someone to make sure no trees had crashed into the place or animals hadn't torn through it. It sounded perfect. I had a beat-up green Subaru Outback and I loaded it with the usuals. Canned food, a couple coolers, propane, flashlight, battery-powered radio, matches, some paperback books, a folding knife, and enough clothes for a week. I planned to stay 5 days, maybe 6. It was October 10th when I left. The air was already getting sharp, and up north the trees had turned full gold and rust red. It was a long drive, and by the time I turned off the highway onto the smaller roads, I'd only seen a handful of cars all day. The road to the cabin was more like a trail. Gravel, uneven, with branches scraping the car on both sides. I hadn't seen a cell signal since over an hour back. There were no signs, no fences, just thick woods. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked like something from a postcard until you got closer. It was a one-story wooden thing, maybe 800 square feet. It sat in a small clearing, roof dark with moss. One window was cracked, and the boards looked warped from years of weather. The front steps creaked, and the door stuck, but it opened. Inside was cold, smelled faintly of mildew and dust, but otherwise okay. One bedroom, one small bathroom with no running water, a living space with a couch and a cast iron stove, and a tiny kitchen with an old Coleman cooler on the counter. There were mouse droppings in the corners, and I found a couple dead flies on the windowsills, but no serious damage. The place had no electricity. There was a generator, but I never got it started. I didn't mind. I was here for quiet, and I had batteries, a headlamp, and a lantern. I swept the floor, unpacked my stuff, and started a small fire in the stove. The first night, I sat outside in a fold-out chair with a blanket around my shoulders and just listened. Wind, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch in the woods. I slept okay. The bed was stiff, but I was tired enough not to care. The second day, I chopped some firewood, walked a mile down the trail, and saw no one. It started drizzling that afternoon and kept going into the evening. I stayed in and read, made some soup, and bundled up in a hoodie and thick socks. It was colder now. That night, I heard something thump against the side of the cabin. I figured it was a branch or something small falling from the trees. The third day is when things started to feel off. I went out early, around 7 a.m., with the idea of walking farther down the path. I took a thermos of coffee and my knife in case I ran into anything. After about 2 miles, I noticed something weird. The path had boot prints on it. Not fresh, but not old either. The rain had softened the dirt, and these prints hadn't been rained on. They were heading the same direction I was. That stopped me cold. I knew this cabin wasn't used anymore. My friend said his uncle hadn't been up there in 4 years. I hadn't seen a single person or car since I arrived. There were no campsites nearby and no other cabins. This trail didn't go anywhere. It just looped around to an old hunting spot his uncle used to visit. I followed the prints for a bit. They were wide set, like from someone tall, and deep enough to show weight. Then they turned off the path into the woods. I didn't follow them. I turned around and walked slowly back to the cabin. I kept checking behind me. I didn't feel watched exactly, but my nerves were up. Back at the cabin, I locked the door for the first time. I ate a little but had no appetite. Around sunset, I stepped outside to grab more firewood and noticed something even weirder. There were drag marks in the dirt by the side of the cabin. Long, wide scuffs like something had been pulled across the ground. I crouched and touched the dirt. It was still damp, and the grooves were fresh. My first thought was animal, maybe a deer got caught in something and dragged it. But the width was wrong, and there were boot prints beside it. Same kind as before. I stood up and looked around. The trees were just standing there. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been right there just hours ago. Watching the cabin, doing something, dragging something. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going and sat with my knife beside me. At one point, I turned off my lantern and just sat in the dark, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard soft crunching in the leaves outside. Not near the front door, but around back near the bathroom wall. Then a bump, then silence. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I must have fallen asleep for an hour or two because the next thing I remember, it was light out. I opened the door and stepped outside. The first thing I saw was a small pile of ash beside the cabin, near the bathroom window. It hadn't been there before. Something had been burned. I poked through it with a stick. There were scraps of fabric, metal bits, something plastic and melted. I couldn't tell what it had been, but it wasn't from the cabin. I hadn't burned anything outside. That was the tipping point. I decided I'd leave the next day. I packed most of my stuff and put it by the door. I didn't want to risk driving out at night. The road was rough, and if I broke an axle or slid off the trail, I'd be stuck without help. I spent the day checking the windows, looking for anything out of place. The woods felt still. No birds, even. No movement. That evening, as the sun dropped below the trees, I looked out through the living room window. Far off, maybe 100 yards back into the woods, I saw something. Tarp. It was green, partially buried under leaves and brush. It looked old, maybe caught on something, but it hadn't been there before. Not in that spot. I would have seen it. I took my binoculars and looked through them. It wasn't just a tarp. It was covering something. I couldn't see exactly what. Just a shape, long and uneven, like a mound. I stared at it for a long time. Then I put the binoculars down, closed the window shutters, and built up the fire. I kept the axe close. I didn't go outside. I tried to sleep, but the wind picked up. Every creak of the trees made my heart jump. I kept seeing that shape in my head. I knew what it looked like, even if I didn't want to admit it, like a body. Next morning, I was out of that cabin by 6:30, threw everything in the car and didn't even eat. The car started on the first try, thank God. I drove slow at first, eyes darting through the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the trail was empty. I hit the main road after an hour, got a signal back near the highway and called my friend. I didn't tell him everything, just said I found signs of people and that I didn't feel safe. He said he'd send someone to check it out. I never heard what they found. I never asked. I didn't want to know if the drag marks led to the tarp, or what was under it. I didn't want to know who'd been walking around out there, or why they'd burned something by the cabin. I had 100 guesses, but not one of them made me feel better. I know it wasn't a ghost story, nothing supernatural, just a cold, real reminder that out there in the woods, far from anyone, the worst thing you can run into isn't a monster. It's another person, and whatever they were doing out there, I wasn't supposed to see it. I'm back in Spokane now. I moved to a place with streetlights and neighbors and locks that actually work. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear something dragging across the floor, but there's nothing there. Not anymore. My name's Ryan Carter. I'm 33 years old, and this happened to me in the fall of 2022, just outside of Whitefield, New Hampshire, near the edge of the White Mountains. I was born and raised in Maine, but I'd been living in New York for years. Life in the city had worn me down: work, traffic, noise, people, always people. I needed to get away from it all for a bit. That's what I told myself when I booked a week-long stay in a remote cabin I found online. It wasn't through a big travel site. I saw it listed on an obscure forum where outdoorsy people shared off-the-grid rental spots. The ad said cabin past Wolf Ridge. No neighbors, no noise, just nature. That was enough for me. I emailed the guy, wired him half the rental fee up front, and he sent me back an old-looking PDF map with a red X drawn on it, along with a few written directions. He told me cell signal wouldn't reach that far, but that there was an emergency satellite phone in the cabin if I needed it. I packed light, just a backpack, some basic food, and my camera gear. I do photography on the side and figured this trip could also be a creative reset. I drove from the city, passed through a few towns, and turned off onto a logging road that looked barely used. From there, I followed a winding dirt trail that climbed up through the trees for about an hour. Eventually, the road ended at a metal gate. I parked, hopped it, and hiked the last mile to the cabin. It was early October, and the air had that crisp bite to it. Red and gold leaves covered the forest floor. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing, tucked between some dense pines and a granite slope. It was older than I expected, probably built in the 60s. It had that musty wood smell, the kind that hits you the second you open the door. One bedroom, one main room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen area, and a bathroom with a composting toilet. No running water, but there were jugs stacked against the wall and a barrel outside to collect rain. There was no electricity, just a lantern and some candles. I didn't mind. That first night, I made some canned soup, lit a few candles, and sat on the front porch with a blanket over my legs. The silence was deep, almost too deep. No engines, no sirens, no buzz of neon signs or chatter. Just wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a branch. I felt better than I had in months. The next morning, I got up around sunrise, made coffee on a little camp stove, and hiked up the ridge behind the cabin. There was a great view from the top, miles of forest stretching out in every direction. I took some photos, sat for a while, and then headed back down. That afternoon, I explored around the area. Found some animal tracks, probably deer, maybe moose. The forest felt untouched, peaceful. I cooked a bit more, read from a book I brought, and went to sleep early. That second night, I heard something outside. A soft thump, then a dragging sound. I sat up, heart beating fast, but reminded myself it was probably a raccoon or a porcupine. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside and saw the lid to the rain barrel had been knocked off. A few jugs of water were lying on their sides, but none were broken. There were no deep prints in the dirt, just scattered leaves and a few scuffed patches near the edge of the woods. It didn't seem like a bear or anything heavy had come through. Later that day, I checked out the satellite phone, just to be sure it worked. It was old and clunky, the kind you had to extend the antenna on, but it powered up. I didn't make a call. I didn't want to use up battery for no reason. That evening, I was chopping wood near the shed when I noticed something strange. Some of the stacked logs looked moved, like they weren't in the same place as before. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby, watching, maybe even inside at some point. That night, it got worse. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a soft scratching sound. It was faint but definitely real. Not the wind. It was rhythmic, like something scraping slowly at the outside wall. I held my breath, waiting. Then it stopped. I stayed frozen in bed for almost an hour, listening. At some point, I must have fallen asleep again. But when I woke up, there was a line carved into the wood outside, just below the bedroom window. A thin, deliberate line about 3 feet long, maybe made with a knife or nail. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I decided to hike back to my car and check in somewhere else. But when I got to the gate where I parked, my car was gone. First, I thought I'd walked to the wrong spot. I ran up and down the trail for 10 minutes, thinking maybe I passed another gate without realizing. But no, it was the same spot. I remembered the broken signpost nearby and the mossy rock with a white streak on it. This was the place, and my car was gone. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes in complete silence. My thoughts were scrambled. I didn't know if I'd been robbed or if this was some sort of prank. I looked around, but the forest just stared back at me, still and empty. I hiked back to the cabin and sat on the porch for hours, waiting, hoping someone would come. A ranger, a hunter, anybody. But no one did. I used the satellite phone. I called the number labeled Emergency Services. The call rang and rang, then dropped. I tried again. Same thing. The battery meter blinked red. I tried one last time before it died completely. Nothing. I was on my own. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lantern on until it burned out. I kept a knife from the kitchen under my pillow. At some point in the early morning, I heard footsteps. Not animal steps, real, heavy footsteps moving slowly around the porch. I lay completely still, holding my breath, barely blinking. Then came a single knock. Not on the door, on the wall. Just a slow, soft tap. And then nothing. I waited until daylight to get up. I opened the door with the knife in hand, stepped out, and looked around. No one, no prints. Nothing had been touched. But in the dirt right in front of the porch steps was a small pile of rocks, stacked carefully, 6 of them, one on top of the other. I don't know why, but that disturbed me more than anything else. Felt like a message, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they could come and go as they pleased. I considered hiking the full trail back to the main road, but it was over 20 miles. I didn't know the way without the car's GPS. The paper map only showed the immediate area. By day 5, I was barely holding it together. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't eaten much, and was starting to feel feverish. I spent most of the day sitting inside with the knife in my lap. Every time I heard a noise, I jumped. Then, just before sunset, I saw something. A man, at the edge of the trees. He was wearing a hooded jacket and standing completely still, half hidden in shadow. I stared at him for what felt like minutes, then blinked, and he was gone. Not walked away, just gone. I ran outside, screaming, but there was nothing, just leaves rustling in the breeze. I didn't go back in. I grabbed my pack, filled 2 jugs with water, and started walking. I didn't care how far it was. I just wanted out. I hiked until it was pitch dark, then kept going by flashlight. Around midnight, I stumbled onto a logging road, different than the one I'd driven in on. I followed it until sunrise, then finally saw a small hunting shack. It was unlocked, abandoned, and had a CB radio. The radio worked. I called for help over and over until someone answered. Took hours for a ranger to get to me. I was dehydrated, filthy, and nearly delirious. They took me to a small station, gave me water and food, and then took my statement. I told them everything. They sent someone to check the cabin, but they didn't find anything unusual. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They did eventually find my car, parked neatly behind an old barn 15 miles south. No damage, no signs of a break-in, like someone had just driven it there and walked away. The rental owner I'd booked with, they couldn't track him down. The email account was deleted. The bank wire went to an untraceable account. The cabin itself wasn't listed in any local records. It's like it wasn't even supposed to be there. To this day, I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know why they chose me or what they wanted. But I do know this, whoever they weren't just passing through. They were patient, they were quiet, and they were watching from the moment I arrived. I haven't gone camping since. I live in Vermont now, in a small town with neighbors on both sides and streetlights that stay on all night. I keep the doors locked, I keep the curtains closed, and I never, ever go into the woods alone.